Hey folks, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you the secret to getting professional live drum recordings. We're talking drum recording today, but before we dive in, if you are ready to take your snare drum recordings to the next level and really start honing your process as an engineer, then I have just the thing for you. It is my essential guide to recording snare drum. And it's just a simple PDF that will walk you through everything you need to know, from picking your microphone to microphone placement to setting your input gain to get a polished and professional sounding snare drum without any more hassle and without any more of the guesswork. It is a completely free guide, and you can download it below using the link in the video description. Now let's jump in here and take a look at these drum recordings. So what's the secret to getting professional sounding live drums when you're recording? The secret is to use EQ and compression on the way in. Whenever you watch any of the pros doing drum recording, whether you're watching Mix with the Masters or Pure Mix videos, they are always using EQ and compression on the way in. If you're not using EQ and compression on the way in, you're going to get decent sounding live drum recordings, but you're going to have to do that EQ and compression more on the back end. If you do it on the way in, you're going to get better sounding live drum recordings, more mix-ready sounding live drums than if you don't. So I'm going to walk you through today my process for EQing and compressing on the way in with live drum recordings here. Let me play you what our drums are sounding like at the moment here. I'm going to go through and mute the rest of our tracks here. Excuse me, here are our live drums at the moment. I'm going to take off the reverb here too. So here's just our tracks here. It's kick in, kick out, 3 snare mics, a snare top, condenser, a bottom, 4 toms, pair of overheads, and a mono room here. I'm sending to a stereo room, but we're not going to use that at the moment. That's not part of the recording process here. Here's the raw drums as they sound just coming in from the room. It's a good sounding kit. It's not a bad sounding kit. It doesn't sound horrible, but it doesn't sound pro and it doesn't sound mix ready. It sounds amateur, right? Got a lot of mid-range, got a lot of that bouncy feeling coming from the kick drum. Our snare drum doesn't have any high crack to it. It's very, very mid-rangey, very average. Feels like it's a home studio tracking, which it is. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add our EQ and compression on the way in that we will bounce our drums through to have them mix ready. Starting here on the kick in mic. Let's take a listen. I'm going to pull up our compressor here and our EQ. Here's what our kick in sounds like by itself. So very bouncy sounding, right? It's got a lot of mid-range, which you're going to get when a mic is inside the kick drum. You're going to get a lot of that mid-range resonance. So here's our EQ. I love using any kind of 550 emulations on drums, especially for EQ. It's very tactile, very practical. So what we're doing here on our kick in is we've got a 2 dB boost here at 50, cutting all 12 dB at 800 hertz. So that's getting rid of all that nasty mid-range. And then a 4 dB boost here at 7K, giving it that nice attack up top, that nice slap up top. And then our compressor here, I love using 160s on kicks and snares on the way in, especially on kick drums. I like using 1176s more on snare drums on the way in. Just doing probably about 3 to 6 dB of compression. So on the bigger hits, 6 dB of compression, smaller hits, probably about 3 dB of compression. And we're using a 2-to-1 ratio here on this unit, and then just adding about 2 dB of gain on the output here. So take a listen, and I will kick this in as we're listening to our kick in here. So there's that kick-in sound that you want, right? All that nasty mid-range is gone, got a little bit more slap up top, a little bit more beef in the low end, and then we get a little bit of tightness from our compressor here. So you can see how much compression we're doing as well. So it's not much here, but a little bit of work on the way in goes a long way to getting you a good drum sound. And that's just our kick in there. So let's take a look at our kick out here. We're going to do the same thing. So here's our EQ here, doing 4 dB boost at 50, because our kick out's going to give us our big low end air. 9 dB cut at 400, so a little bit in the low mids. And then a 6 dB boost at 10K. So a little bit of air getting added to our kick out there on the top end. Same compressor here, same kind of settings, 2-to-1, doing about 3 to 6 dB of compression on the louder hits there, and then 2 dB of gain on the output there for that. So same thing here. I'll play it before. You can hear what it sounds like before, and then I will kick this unit in. You can hear the before and after on our kick out here. Tightens up our sound, gives it a ton more beef, lots of nice air up on top, and we get rid of all of that funky low mid energy that we don't need. So just about shifting these frequencies around to get a good sounding kit. Here's our kick drum as a whole now, and I'll A/B both of these units here. Takes us from a decent sounding kick drum, an amateur sounding kick drum, to a great sounding kick drum. Really, really going to sit well when we get to mix time there. Gives us a great starting point. We're going to go through our snare here, and that is it. You can see I don't do any work on the toms on the way in, no EQ on the toms. You could put an EQ on each tom if you want to do same 550 unit and just pull out a little bit at 400 and maybe add a little bit up top, but I like to leave the toms pretty open there. We get a really good tom sound on the way in. No need to touch that there. Just running them straight in. No work on the overheads there, and we only do a little bit of work here on the room, which I'll show you. That's optional. It depends on the room sound you're going for. Let's take a listen to our snare top here. Same kind of work here, okay? Using that same 550, a little bit less work though. 2 dB boost at 100 gives us some weight on our snare drum. That's that low weight that we want, gives you some beef there. And then a 4 dB boost here at 5K. So that's that high end, that nice crack that you want on your snare drum. It's going to give you a little bit of air as well. And then I like to run my snare drums into this FET comp here, or the 1176 emulation. Only going to do about 3 dB of compression here. You don't want to go so far on the way in that you over compress your snare drum, and then you have to fight that in your mix. This is also the reason I do this inside the DAW rather than printing it off the board. I run it on the board so we hear it while we're working and I have a good starting point, but I also hook it up inside the DAW here. So you can chain them together if you have a Studio Live board, right? You can link them to your board so you can work at the same time. So any tweaks I make here on the board show up in the DAW, but I don't have to commit to that sound until after the session. I can make sure everything's right, the compressor settings are set right before I bounce through these units. So here's our snare drum here. Take a listen and I will kick this unit in. You can hear not a lot of work on our snare drum, right? It's not a huge difference, just a subtle change gives our snare drum a little bit more tack coming from this compressor here, and a nice bit of air and a nice bit of weight on the bottom. Subtle changes here, but it's a nice bit of shaping on the way in to get our snare drum a little bit further towards a good mix starting point. The Snare High is pretty much the same as the Snare Top. So for me, the Snare High mic is just a condenser taped to my 57 on the snare drum. Gives me a little bit more top end. You can see that's what we're emphasizing here on that 50 hertz boost here on the Snare High. So going a little bit more towards the sub area. The 100 hertz was a little bit much because it is a condenser. And then 4 dB boost at 5K, bringing out that air. Same compressor here, doing about the same thing. Same 3 dB of compression. These are the settings I usually use on snare drum. We're at about 0.55 on the attack, 0.55 milliseconds, and then a 50 millisecond release. Take a listen here, a before and after on this condenser. Again, a nice subtle little change. Just feel some of that weight come up, and you feel the top end open up from that 4 dB boosted 5K, excuse me. A little bit of tightening, a little bit of emphasis on the attack from the compressor. Snare bottom here, same kind of moves. So pretty similar moves across our snare drum, so we're not doing any big drastic changes on these mics here. 100, we're doing a 2 dB boost there at 100. No cuts in the mid-range on our snare drum. You want to keep your mid-range. You can do any kind of cuts you need in the mid-range in the mixing process. I like to preserve the mid-range during the recording process so it doesn't get too scooped sounding. And then a 2 dB boost at 10K here, so it's not getting too rattly in the high-mid area or too nasty sounding. So gentle boosts there. Same compressor here, doing about 3 dB compression on those louder hits here. Take a listen, a before and after on our snare bottom. Subtle differences there across our snare drum. A little bit of beef, a little bit of air, and some tightening from our compressor. But let's take a listen to our snare drum as a whole before, and then I'll kick in these EQs and compressors, and you can hear the after as a whole as a package, all 3 snare mics. Little changes are going a long way to get our snare drum in a better place at the start of the mixing process here. So coming off our recording process, we want our drums to be in a good place for the mix. You don't want to pull up your kick drum and be like, man, that sounds terrible. You want to pull up your kick drum and be like, oh, this is going to be a good mix session. Going to be easy, going to be breezy. Last move here is optional, but this is something I do on my room mic, is I roll off the top end. This isn't something I print to the mix or print to the track. It's just there, and I know it's there. I do put it on in the recording process, though. It wipes off all the cymbal noise in the room mic, so my room mic is just giving me some low end and some low mids just to pull up underneath the mix. I don't want to hear a bunch of cymbal noise coming from my room mic. If you do, that's great. Again, this is a taste thing here. This is something I'm doing for my drums here, so I can pull up my room mic a little bit further and get some of that low end and low mid energy for my kick and snare. Last thing we're going to do here is I'm going to solo my kick and my snare, and I'm going to A-B these EQs and compressors so you can hear our before and after with the processing here. So we'll start before, you can hear our kick and snare raw, and then I'm going to kick in the processing here. You can hear our after, our finished drum recordings here. Hear the difference we get from these changes? Don't discount the process of EQing and compressing your drums on the way in. Don't leave it for the mixing process. This is part of the recording process. Putting some EQ in, putting some compression in is crucial to getting a good drum sound, a good, fat, and tight drum sound on the way in, especially on your kick, especially on your snare. Those are the star of the show. Don't overlook them. Don't overlook the EQ. Don't overlook the compression. Now, this isn't to say that you don't want to get a good raw recording. You can hear subtle changes on our snare drum there, right? We have a good, solid snare drum recording to sound with. You got to make sure your tuning's right. You got to make sure your mic placement is right. This is an additive after the fact. After you get your good, solid recordings, EQ and compression enhances those recordings for the mixing process. So you're at a better starting point when you come to mix these tracks. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you are ready to take your snare recordings to the next level and really start dialing in your strategy as a recording engineer, then I have just the tool for you, and it is completely free. It is my essential guide to recording snare drum, and you can download it below to start creating more professional snare recordings in less time. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you in the next video.